Hi, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Reading the Gospels Through Hebrew Eyes. We're going to take a look at a pivotal, if not the pivotal moment in Mark's Gospel. It's from chapter 8, and it is the confession of St. Peter when Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" Now, Peter's account is unique in that it's immediately preceded by the healing of a blind man. A unique healing because it happens in two different stages. Many commentators think that this two-stage healing sets the thematic stage for the twofold confession and clarification of who Jesus is right afterward. So we'll discuss that. And also, right after Peter makes his confession, we have this heated discussion between Peter and Jesus, where Peter rebukes Jesus and Jesus in turn rebukes Peter, and then we have this language of Satan thrown in. Well, where did this language of Satan come from? It turns out there's a long prehistory in the Old Testament in the Hebrew to Satan or the Satan. So I'll give you a little bit of clarification on the history of Satan, that word, and the verb associated with it as well. So some real interesting material to get to. Let's start with the opening couple of verses. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist." And others say, "Elijah," and others, "one of the prophets." And he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he strictly charged them to tell no one about him. Now, if you notice on the map here, just to get our bearings, toward the south you have the Sea of Galilee. We have the city of Capernaum marked, which we've talked about a couple of times. Bethsaida is on the eastern side of the sea, and that is where the blind man will be healed. We'll get to that in a second. And then at the top you have Caesarea Philippi, which is about 100 miles to the north of Jerusalem. This, by the way, was formerly the city of Panias or Panion. It's close to Mount Hermon. It was enlarged by Philip and then renamed Caesarea in honor of Augustus Caesar, so Caesarea Philippi. Now, they might not have actually gone to the city itself. It says they went to the villages around there. So perhaps they went into some of these unwalled areas around the city of Caesarea Philippi to perhaps some Jewish villages in that area. So they're there or on the way, and Jesus asks them, "Who do people say that I am?" More or less, you've been hanging out around the crowds. You've heard them talk. So what's their opinion? What are they saying about me? And we're given this answer: John the Baptist. That's what they say. Or they say that you're Elijah, or they say that you're one of the other prophets. Presumably they mean one of the other Old Testament prophets. Now, when Matthew records this event, he throws in the name Jeremiah. So some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say Jeremiah, or one of the prophets. So we have a lot of different ideas, but they all really center around one kind of identification. Jesus is a prophet. And this should not surprise us, because we know from the ending of Malachi's words that there was talk of God sending the prophet Elijah back before the great and awesome day of the Lord. And this led to all sorts of traditions that are called the redivivus traditions. That basically means there's this expectation of someone who once lived, who's going to come back and is going to accomplish some task. And these are pretty widespread in the ancient world. We have a number of Elijah redivivus traditions, and these all hinge on those words from Malachi chapter 4, 5, and 6. "Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the great and awesome day of the Lord comes." And we have this reflected in some writings in the Apocrypha. I have these all listed out there for you on the slide. In the Apocrypha, in 1st Enoch and 4th Ezra, in a number of Dead Sea Scrolls, as well as early Jewish literature. So those are the expectations. A lot of people are saying, "You're a prophet. Perhaps you're that most recent prophet, John the Baptist, who was beheaded, who's now come back to life. Maybe you're Elijah." That was probably the most widespread opinion as to who Jesus was. Or maybe some people thought he was Moses or Elisha or who knows. But they all thought, because of his miracle working ability, because of the way that he taught and preached with authority, because of kind of his whole character and ministry, they thought that he was a prophet. Now, did they think that he was more than that? Possibly. But at this point, that's the only thing that we're told, both in Mark and in Matthew and in Luke's version of this particular incident. Then Jesus turns everything around and he says, okay, so you've told me what everybody's opinion is. That's fine. Everybody has opinions about who I am, Jesus might still say, right? But the important thing is not what people's opinions are, but who do you say that I am? In particular, I don't want your opinion. I want your confession. Who do you confess me to be? And Peter, the mouthpiece of the rest of the disciples, says 4 words in Greek, 4 words in English: you are the Christ. Now, what does Christ mean? Well, it comes from the Greek Christos, as you probably know, which of course is just transliterated into English as Christ. But then that is based upon the Hebrew Mashiach, from which we get our word Messiah. Both Christ as well as Messiah, or Christos and Mashiach, they both mean someone who has been anointed. If you look in the Hebrew of the Old Testament, there are a number of small m messiahs. That is, there were a number of people who were anointed. It wasn't that unique. It was not unusual at all for people put into certain positions or offices to be anointed. Kings were anointed. Priests were anointed. Sometimes, I suppose, prophets were anointed, primarily kings and priests, but there were a number of anointed ones in the Old Testament. This then became kind of a general designation for the capital M Messiah, the anointed one, who's known by a number of different names in the Old Testament, including the servant of the Lord in the book of Isaiah. So this servant, or this Mashiach, this Messiah, he then comes into Greek as the Christ. And that, of course, is Peter's confession. Now, this is important because up to this point in Mark's gospel, Jesus has been called a number of things, but with the exception of the opening verse of Mark's gospel, he has not been called Christ until this moment. So I have a list here for you of what he's been called up to this moment. In the opening verse, Mark identifies him as Jesus the Christ. The unclean spirit calls him the Holy One of God. He refers to himself twice as the Son of Man. He's called the Son of God. And a couple of times he's also referred to as a didaskalos, or a teacher. Okay, so he's the Christ. Now, this is kind of the first stage of this confession. It's great that Peter said, you are the Christ, but that's really not yet enough, because what exactly does that mean? What does that entail? What will the Christ do? What will be done to the Christ? See, it's not enough simply to stop there, because you need to define exactly what you mean by the anointed one. The anointed one who does what? The anointed one who suffers what? So we have to move to the next stage of this clarification of who Christ is. And that comes to us in the next 2 verses. Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. So here we have a 4-fold prediction. Jesus will suffer many things, be rejected, be killed, and rise again. Now, I want to focus on the word rejected in just a second, but before I do, I want to make sure that we're all thinking through this. Jesus is a long way from Jerusalem. He is a long way both spatially as well as chronologically. It's going to be a while before he gets there. Well before Jesus gets to Jerusalem, he knows what awaits him there. This is important because his arrest, his trial, his crucifixion, all of that did not come as a surprise. It was not an accident of history. It was not kind of plan B that all these things happened. Jesus knew what would befall him when he got to Jerusalem. He went in with eyes wide open. As the book of Hebrews might say, for the joy set before him, he went in with his eyes wide open because love compelled him forward to the city of Jerusalem to suffer many things, to be rejected, to be killed, and on the 3rd day to rise again. His crucifixion was not an accident. It was not avoidable. His crucifixion was exactly why Jesus came. So, Peter says you are the Christ. Amen to that. That's exactly right. But then Jesus clarifies what it means to be the Christ. The Christ is the one who suffers many things, who is rejected, killed, and raised on the 3rd day. That is the full confession, the full clarification of who Christ is. Now, let me talk about one of these words that Jesus uses. It's the word for rejected, apodokimazo in the Greek. Now, this occurs in a couple of different places that are significant for our understanding of who Jesus is. And it's in both cases, it's really sort of the same place. It's a quote from the Old Testament and the New Testament, and in the Old Testament, it comes from the book of Psalms. So in Mark 12, this is Jesus speaking, and he says, "Have you never read this scripture? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." He's quoting from Psalm 118, where it says, "The stone that the builders rejected," using that same Greek verb, has become the cornerstone. So Psalm 118, long before Jesus used this language of rejection, Psalm 118 had brought up this language of rejection. This cornerstone, chosen by God, designed by God, sent by God, was rejected by the chief priests and the elders and the scribes because it did not match what they expected, what they anticipated. Jesus did not conform to their Christological expectations. And interestingly, as we see in this very story itself, nor did it conform to Peter's expectations. He doesn't like the idea of a crucified cornerstone, a crucified Christ either. It's just a reminder that when Jesus came, he came as one that didn't fit people's expectations. He is the one who comes as the rejected Messiah, who in his very rejection brings us to the acceptance of the Father. Okay. So Jesus says this, and then what happens after that? Well, now we have Peter's rebuke of Jesus. Peter hears all this, and he took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. And turning and seeing his disciples, Jesus rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of men." By the way, 3 times in this short account, the same Greek verb epitimao, which is translated as strictly charge or rebuke, is used. So epitimao is used when Jesus strictly charged the disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. And it's used when Peter rebukes Jesus, epitimao, and then Jesus turns around and uses epitimao to rebuke Peter. So 3 times the same word is used. So Peter, when he hears Jesus say this, thinks it doesn't really fit with who the Messiah, who the Christ should be. Even though he's got half the confession, he doesn't have the other half of the confession. He's still a little bit half blind as to who the Messiah is. And this then sends us back to what I talked about at the beginning of the video, this account that immediately precedes this confession on the part of Peter. So if you look in the verses leading up to Jesus' question, you have the story of the healing of a blind man in Bethsaida, where you have a 2-stage healing. So what happens first is Jesus puts some saliva on this guy's eyes, and he can sort of half see. He can see people, but they look like trees walking around. And then after that, Jesus works more powerful healing, and all of a sudden the guy can see clearly. So we go from half seeing to fully seeing. That's the same thing that happens in this particular account that follows that. You have sort of a half seeing. Peter says you are the Christ. It's true, but he's only got kind of half seeing who Christ is. The second part of this, the second stage, is when Jesus clarifies exactly what it means to be the Christ, that the Son of Man will suffer and be rejected and be killed and be raised on the 3rd day. That is when we clearly see who the Messiah is. Now let me explain a little bit about this language of Satan. So there's a long prehistory of Satan or Satan or the Satan in the Old Testament. I won't go into all of it here, but this can kind of give you a thumbnail view of how this is used. So language changes over time, right? We all know this from English or whatever your native language might be. You know that if you read something from a century or 5 centuries before, language is different. Words change in their meaning. Words change in the way they're spelled. If you read, for instance, Shakespeare in English, or if you read the Canterbury Tales, even older English, you'll see a lot of huge differences between the way they spoke and used the same language that we use and the way that we speak and write now. Well, Hebrew is no different. Of course, the Old Testament was written over a long, long period of time, and so often the language would change in meaning and nuance over the course of those years. And Satan is a good example of that. So the very first occurrence we have of the verb Satan in the Old Testament, interestingly, is a activity of God. When God sends his angel to oppose Balaam, to stand in the path of Balaam, who's riding his donkey on the way to curse Israel, the verb that's used there for standing in the way, for acting as an adversary, or for opposing is Satan. So in that first occurrence, it's God's angel who is sataning, that is, acting as an adversary to Balaam. Now you get into, for instance, the life of David, and his adversaries or his enemies are referred to as Satan, his opponents, those who stood against him or those who accused him. You also have this language used in the book of Psalms. And then you have other occurrences, for instance, in the opening of Job and in some of the prophets, you have the language of Satan or the Satan that is used. Only a couple of places in the Old Testament is it used as an actual name, the way that we think of it from the New Testament, kind of a capital S, Satan. Most of the time, it is used for a human adversary, a human accuser, someone who stands in the way of someone else. Now, if you look in Mark's gospel, he uses it several different times, and every single time he uses it as what we might call a capital S, Satan. So in Mark chapter 1, Jesus is tempted by Satan. In Mark 3, we have this debate between Jesus and the Pharisees about Satan casting out Satan, and then we have that continuing in Mark 3:26. In Mark 4:15, when Jesus explains the parable of the sower, he talks about how Satan comes and takes away the word that is sown in people's hearts. And then we have this in Mark chapter 8. So, with all that kind of as a background, what is Jesus communicating? Why does he say, get behind me, Satan, and not get behind me, Peter? Well, I think we can take this a couple different ways. On the one hand, he could be saying, listen, Peter, you're acting as an adversary, as a small s Satan to me. You're acting as an opponent. You're standing in my path, the path that leads me to crucifixion. So get behind me instead of standing as a barrier in my way. But we could also take this as the capital S Satan is speaking through Peter. Peter is trying to keep Jesus away from the cross. He's trying to prevent him from his God-given mission. And so in that way, Satan is using Peter as a mouthpiece to keep Jesus away from the path of the cross. Both of these could be true at the same time. Capital S, Satan, in the sense that Peter is opposing Jesus. Capital S, small s, Satan for Peter. Capital S, Satan for Satan speaking through Peter to keep Jesus from the cross. Either way, the impact is that someone, Peter or Satan through Peter, is trying to keep Jesus from the very place to which he must go if he is to be the Christ. It's not enough to be you cannot be an uncrucified Messiah. You cannot be the uncrucified Christ. If you are the Christ, you will be crucified. If you are the Messiah, you'll be crucified, because that is the reason for which he came, to give his life, to suffer, to die, to be rejected, and then to be raised again in order that he might actually be our Messiah, be our Christ, so that in him we might have the forgiveness and the life and the salvation from the Father. That's what it means to be the Christ, to suffer and to give his life on our behalf. Well, that's a quick run through. I hope that it's been helpful for you. As always, I didn't get a video out last week because, well, we were snowed under in South Texas and we lost our power and we couldn't do hardly anything, much less make videos. So back at it this week. Everything's well. Power's back on. We have water. Everything's good once more. Hope everything's good with you as well. And I pray God's richest peace and mercy upon each of you. And we'll see you, God willing, next week.